So this is something that we are seeing again. I mentioned in my introduction that we are seeing school closings now. So there's a conversation happening about how necessary it is for Black and brown residents of Austin to kind of reclaim, to kind of decide for themselves what their housing situation is going to look like, what their education system is going to look like. And I just think it's so interesting to see how these things replay in history over and over again. So the idea of a freedmen's community is something that is resurgent. Now it is something that is reappearing in our conversations, and it's really important for us to ask ourselves why marginalized communities consistently have to come up with ways to care for themselves and for their families independently of systems that are supposed to serve them.
1928 master plan. What do y'all know about the master plan? Other stuff that maybe I haven't said.
I think that was one of the plans which systematically racially discriminated people, and it was the idea of redlining, the idea of certain zones only meant for certain color of people, and that was, and if you are not willing to relocate to those areas, then the government amenities that you should be provided, like park, sewer, education, you don't get them.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Yeah, pretty much everything that she said, but it also created like a separate Negro district, so kind of mandated that if you wanted city services, you had to move to a specific area of Austin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of those services were schools, and you had communities like Clarksville that said, you know, we're staying, we're going to remain, but there were a good number of residents decided to dismantle churches brick by brick and take them across and rebuild where they were allowed to live. The Black community was invested in trying to hold on to some sense of the beauty that they had started to create and try and work within the parameters that they had, while still, like Njera has been talking about, you know, envisioning what else can be done outside of what institutions or the government, the state allow you to do. You know, how can you create, how can you be resilient when there are so many different things that don't want you to be.
And so here we have an example where obviously, it goes without saying, people of color were not at the table when this this master plan was created. So Code Next is brought to mind, you know, this tool that the city of Austin wants to use to determine where things will be built, how things will be built. And once again, marginalized people are left out of that conversation. So what are we going to end up with? More Negro districts? What will be the result of that? Excluding marginalized communities, people of color, from the conversation surrounding Code Next.
And with the creation of this separate district, the East Side also had the weakest zoning restrictions. There were issues with the racial covenants and the redlining. So the areas that are to the left, on the map on the left, those had racial covenants. So in the beginning, before you saw the increase in the Mexican American and the Mexican community, prior to the revolution, a lot of the deed restrictions just said, you know, no Black people. They targeted Black people. Once the population of Mexicans and Mexican Americans started to grow, they began to change the deed restrictions so that it said white only. So in order to be, I guess, more inclusive in their exclusion, capture more people by saying white only. And the map on the left has both the racial covenants, the deed restrictions, and the redlining. You know, so like you mentioned, the redlining, right? So even though the Black community and the brown community was forced to move east of the highway, they wouldn't be able to get a mortgage to buy a home. That means that they wouldn't be able to access one of the tools that we know is the biggest wealth builder for people, which is buying a home. The wealth gap today is, I I don't have a slide on it. I don't have the specific numbers, but it is staggering, and it is getting bigger and bigger between communities of color and white people. And part of this is rooted in exclusion from being able to buy a home and to use this as a wealth building asset in communities. And one other side thing, related thing to this is also, I mean, thinking about what was happening at the national level with the GI Bill and vets that were returning from World War II, and with the GI Bill able to access money to go to, get education, get training, and loans to buy a home. And that wasn't the same opportunity that was offered to Black vets of color. They couldn't access that tool to begin building that wealth by buying a home. And this is a more updated map of where the industrial land use is. I mean, like you can still see 1928 to 2000, that industrial land use is still east of 35. It's what's allowed the oil tank farms to be there. I know Susana last time also talked about the pure casting facility that is currently next to Sanchez Elementary. I think it produces some kind of metal parts, and we did surveys, talked to residents there several years ago, and I mean, they've been reporting finding all of this particulate matter on their cars, on their doors. So it's stuff that you're breathing in that you don't even know what it is, but it's there in your community because of this history of zoning in East Austin. I'll keep that out. So in the 30s and 40s, we saw public housing. It continued the segregation that we were seeing in the city. Austin had the first public housing projects in the country. Santa Rita, Rosewood, and Chalmers are all still there, and a lot of these are now surrounded by a bunch of luxury apartments. I question how much longer those public housing projects are going to be able to remain as they are. I know that there's been a big fight around preservation of Rosewood and at least renovating some of these public housing projects, but you see this change, right, in what was there and what started and the types of structures that are now going up, how the community is changing, the wealth of the community is changing. It's affluent people who are white and Black and brown, though they are predominantly white in these in the communities. So kind of moving forward a little bit, you started to have the struggle for integration in the city, not only in the neighborhoods, in the schools as well. Volma Overton, how many of you have heard of Volma Overton? I know who they are. So they were one of the presidents of the NAACP. In 1964, he conducted a read-in at a meeting of the Austin City Council to protest the council's refusal to consider an ordinance forbidding racial discrimination and to create a human rights commission. Through years of organizing and hard work, in 1967, the city finally passed a fair housing ordinance, and now we know, or at least I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the city's commissions, there is a human rights commission that exists at the city level. So there were these efforts to, acknowledging that there was beauty in the resistance, right? There was beauty in the alternatives that people had tried to create in East Austin, and there was still that recognition that we still don't have access to the same opportunities. There isn't equity here. There isn't equity in the institutions, and not everybody's voices and concerns are being taken into account.
So one thing that happens or has happened from my experience in terms of establishing the Human Rights Commission, or let's say we're talking about the African American Quality of Life Commission, we kind of see tokenization occur. We see, Black and brown people of a particular economic or social status take positions on these commissions, and there's no real relationship with the community, with grassroots efforts in the community, or with the residents of the communities that these the people who hold these positions are supposed to represent. And so it looks like progress, and that is one of the reasons Austin has felt comfortable proclaiming itself a progressive or liberal city, because we do have commissions, we do have, African Americans on city council, there have to be procedures, protocols, steps built in to ensure that the feedback that the city receives from the community is then incorporated into the policy that they develop and the decisions that they make. And a Human Rights Commission or an African American Quality of Life Commission does not ensure that.
One of the other pieces around the integration of neighborhoods was also the integration of the schools. The Black community in particular bore the burden of the integration as far as, schools that the Black community had created and turned into something beautiful being closed. And as a result, the Black students were bused to predominantly white schools. So we still see that in terms of who bears the burden of integrating. It's usually communities of color. And it goes back to what we've talked about as far as who is in those decision-making positions, who has a seat at the table to say, this is what my community needs, this is what my community wants to see, this is my vision for how we can create something better. And so the Clarksville School that was started in the early 1910s closed in the 60s around the time of school integration. And the students that were there at the time, they ended up going to what is now O. Henry Middle School. Moving forward a few years, 70s and 80s, urban removal. It was technically called urban renewal, but communities on the east side saw it as further displacement, the continuation of the city telling them, we don't want you here. We're going to keep moving you while we continue to identify land that is attractive, that's close to amenities that we want. You don't have the power to stop us, so we're going to make these decisions and tell you that this is how things are going to happen. And we keep bringing this up because it's really important as future planners or policymakers, people that are going to be doing some kind of work in the community, to think about some of this history, regardless of whether you stay in Austin or not, but to think of the role that you are going to play. How are you going to work with communities? How are you going to pay attention to who is in the room when decisions are being made, whose voices are being heard? Are the same methods being used to conduct outreach and checking off boxes saying we did our due diligence? If people aren't here, it's because they don't care. It's all of these different processes, whether we're talking about Code Next or the school bond that is going to be up for a vote in November. You could say that both have done outreach, and if you look at who's participated, you probably maybe wouldn't come to the same conclusion. Engagement goes much deeper than posting notices and posting things on websites. If you're thinking critically about who's able to access information in English, who has reliable internet and a computer. You may have a cell phone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a smartphone. All of these little pieces that influence whether or not people are able to truly and genuinely participate in processes and have their concerns heard and acknowledged. And this is from Anderson High School before. The original Anderson High School was one of the schools that ended up closing, and the irony, I don't know if that's the best word, but it turned into the Alternative Learning Center, where students are sent if they are suspended. And who's primarily suspended? Black and brown students in Austin ISD. So that's why we think these connections are really important to make, just as far as how students are separated, how communities are separated, how you're told whether or not you belong. Those messages are communicated in different ways through different practices.
So I am glad that Rocío brought up what Old Anderson became, and this is happening again. So when the bond issue, before it became a bond issue, when it was still a planning issue, when they were planning out what facilities would look like, how they would make changes, Old Anderson came up in conversation again. There's a school on the east side called LBJ, and LBJ is integrated, but really segregated. LBJ is actually a magnet school, LASA, and LBJ itself. And when you go to LBJ, you see that LASA is 98%, it might be 98.5 or something like that, white. And LBJ is significant majority POC. LASA receives tons of new technology because they're the well-performing school. LBJ receives none of the same. And so in our work, in trying to talk to the community about how they felt about this segregation, essentially, I mean, we heard from so many students who were disheartened. You know, oh, we see magnet students, AKA white students, receiving brand new technology, brand new course books. There's literally tape that they would use in the school to prevent the students from interacting, keeping LASA and LBJ separate. How does Old Anderson come into this? Well, they decide that LASA is doing so well that it needs its own facility, right? They're now going to remove LASA from LBJ. And two things are happening here. So Old Anderson came into the conversation as a place for LASA to go. So again, Black history kind of being stripped from the people who it kind of belongs to, right? And also, LBJ is facing closure. The school that is home to mostly Black and brown students might not even be able to stay open because of enrollment now that LASA might be leaving. So here these white students get a brand new, mostly white, I'm just being honest, get a brand new facility, and the Black and brown students see their school close. And Anderson, which is a huge, they haven't made this decision, but Old Anderson, which is a huge staple in our history, as Rocío has showed us, we lose that as well. So when she's talking about losing the beauty that has been built, irrespective of everything that has occurred over time to prevent these communities from really being able to take pride in their surroundings, this is another example of that. And I'm sorry if I kind of sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but I really just want to drive home how this happens over and over and the impact that it has on communities of color.
And just a quick point of clarification. So LASA is going to be moved into Eastside Memorial, and it's the Eastside Memorial students who are going to be placed in the original Anderson High School. But even there, Eastside Memorial, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the history and the changes at Eastside Memorial. It started out, it was one of the schools, or it was originally Johnston. It was created during the integration efforts, and essentially the school district has had its hands in Eastside Memorial in changing what it wants to do with that school for a long time. There was talk of closing that school before, but the community rallied around it and prevented it from being closed. So it's, again, a situation where the students and the community members that are associated with Eastside Memorial, or what was in Johnston, feel like something is always being done to them. They don't have a say in saying, this is what we want to see in our school. It's just kind of like, this is what's going to happen to you. And this is just a picture from the first day of integration or busing at Crockett High School here in Austin in the early 70s. Around this time, you know, there were efforts, like Njera mentioned, around having communities of color represented both in the city council and the school board, and positions were gained. It was during the Black Power movement, civil rights movement, the Chicano civil rights movement that also was pretty strong here in Texas, in San Antonio and Crystal City. to some degree here in Austin as well. One of the offshoots of that was the establishment of the Juarez Lincoln University, which was created by the Mexican American Youth Organization in Mission, Texas. It was originally in Fort Worth. It was moved to Austin. Fun fact is Leonard Nimoy, or Spock from Star Trek, got his degree from this university. It was under the umbrella of, I think, Antioch College in Ohio, but he got his degree from here. But once this area started to become attractive to developers, the land sold, and the mural that so many people had seen, so many people in the Mexican American community had seen, the work of Raul Valdez, who is a prominent muralist here in Austin, who's done amazing murals throughout the city, throughout the state. They took a bulldozer right into the woman's face in here and, demolished everything, despite objections from the community who are saying this isn't what we want to see. But the interest of developers and money spoke louder than the community needs did. And I think at this point, it's been an ongoing struggle with the school board, with schools, with housing, with displacement, people continuing to feel the effects of segregation, of racism in this city, of the 1928 master plan, and feeling as though these institutions that were created don't represent them. I'm feeling like these institutions aren't for them. Looking at more recently how we're still very divided by income, right? Wealthy is west, poor is east. Some of those patterns are changing with the Eastern Crescent. You see poverty and communities of color now exist along an Eastern Crescent in the city, but the wealth is still primarily on the west side. The land and environment is primarily protected on the west side. And many of this goes back to that 1928 master plan with the zoning and the restrictions. Today, with where students are even, the white students are primarily in West Austin. Black students, the percentages are so low, which is why you see so much yellow. Yellow is the lowest percentage, red is the highest percentage. They're throughout the city, but the percentages are so low. The areas where they're concentrated is in the Northeast, in the areas that Njera has talked about. The Latino population is the one that you see along the Eastern Crescent, which is where you see the poverty too, in the low-income communities. And to another degree, the Asian population, which has been growing. It's still scattered. It's not as big as the other areas, as the other populations in the city, but more heavily concentrated still west of the highway. How many of you heard about Jumpoline? What happened with Jumpoline?
Isn't that that's the pinata shop that they shut down and put a cat cafe everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now there's like a bar or a coffee shop where they have cats in the restaurant. I don't know if you know about y'all, I don't really want cats.
Yeah, so it was replaced by Blue Cat Cafe. The owners were driving up to their business, and this is essentially what they found. They were supposedly given a notice, but they show up, and the entire structure with their things still inside is demolished. This mural, painting over the mural, happened at around the same time as the mural that's on 12th and Chicon. This mural was painted during a conference, I want to say it was maybe 6 years ago, that UT hosted, Rethinking Power and Resistance. There was an amazing artist from Ecuador who came to the conference and partnered with a group here called Mamas of Color Rising, and they have a side project called Mama Sana Vibrant Woman. And they created this mural close, pretty much right off of where 12th and Chicon is, as a representation, celebrating Black women, Black mothers, Black culture in this part of town that is seeing the continued loss of the Black community. And it was replaced by this. And so what we've seen and what we've experienced and what has felt really frustrating for someone like me who grew up in East Austin, who heard all sorts of comments from students, from community members when I was growing up. I went to Keeling in the magnet program. I went to LBJ in the magnet program. All sorts of comments about ghetto East Austin, how undesirable it was, all of the stigma associated with the East Austin. But now we see this kind of co-opting of what is East and this new branding of the East Side. So this is like East Village Lofts, East Side Austin Elite Fitness. You've got East Side Pedal Pushers, Elon East on Manor, Austin East Siders. You can even get your hard cider. That's on 11th Street. East Side Pies, who Njera just told me apparently won't even deliver far east. Just, a little east. So there's this interesting change, right? Change in the community, change in the way that we as a city are thinking about East Austin, that essentially doesn't acknowledge the history of the struggle that the community has been through. That doesn't acknowledge the continued struggle for a sense of autonomy and self-determination from people. I think that's ultimately what people want, to be able to have a say and not to be told this is what's going to happen to you. These are the parameters within which you can work and you can live. These are the opportunities that you can access. It's about having a seat at the table and being able to be a part of processes that shape the way that our city looks, the way that our schools look. And going far beyond that.
And I think what it's important to remember is that communities of color or marginalized communities are not asking for representation's sake. So when we say, the character of East Austin is changing, what does that really mean? My grandmother purchased her first home in East Austin, and she was a part of a wave of black professionals who were able to purchase homes for the first time. All around her, the people who purchased homes with her are losing those homes, right? Mostly because property taxes are skyrocketing as these things begin to happen in East Austin, and then because the people who purchased them are passing away. And they were not able to build wealth because of many of the things that we discussed today. Their kids are left not knowing how to hold on to their parents' home. And so the neighborhood that my mother grew up in and that I would go to for Christmases and Easters for Easter egg hunts, it doesn't look like what it did when I was a child. And that is traumatic, right? It's not just that, you have to move. I've heard people make comments like, well, you can start over in Pflugerville. But this home is where the heart is. I know that's cliche and cheesy, but when you're at the end of your life, do you want to see all that you've worked for flushed down the drain because of the fact that there is no representation at this level? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about losing homes. We're talking about inequitable education. Rocío mentioned Keeling. I'm a facilitator for a program at Keeling Middle School, and I just spoke to students who were saying the same thing. I mean, this is 6th through 8th grade. You're 11 through 13, wondering why a portion of the school looks one way, or wondering why other schools have more access, hearing your parents and grandparents talk about how your school might be closed this year. And you just want to play football and attend class and, enjoy your middle school experience. That's what we're really talking about here. I don't want this to be abstract in your minds.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately, people are fighting for the right to remain. I think about people who are maybe in my parents' shoes. My parents are older. My mom just turned 71. My dad is turning 81. They were both older parents. They are going through a series of health issues. They are struggling with, how do we maintain this house? So, the families that were able to get homes, they didn't necessarily have the money or were approved for loans to be able to upkeep your home. So if you can't upkeep your home, there's a chance that you could lose it. You know, my parents are just going through trying to get the foundation repaired, getting a ramp installed in their home now so that they can stay there because of mobility issues, right? Needing to be able to access and actually take advantage of their house. And if they don't have a ramp at their age, they can't do that. So it's so many little things that are affecting people's ability, people's right to stay, to say this is where I want to live, this is where I deserve to live, and to be able to actually do that. And I think we'll close there.
Yeah, I have a question, but first a comment. You know, it's so interesting to see the parallels between the conversations that you're having in East Austin and the ones in my very own neighborhood of Barton Hills. That the elderly are saying, gosh, we're being priced out. The houses are, somebody tries to fix their house so they can have an extra room downstairs because they can no longer do the stairs to upstairs, and they can't get the building permits for it. And more houses are being bought to rent out and wait for the houses to go up in value. So it's losing the neighborhood feel, and a lot of people are being forced out because of property taxes. And that's a white neighborhood, a white middle-class neighborhood, suffering from, you know, similar things at a different level. My real question for you is, given that First Imagine Austin and now Code Next, you know, is happening, and it's such an important issue for neighborhoods all across the city. Right now on their website there are about 10 public meetings, interactive meetings that a person could go to spread around different parts of town. It would be useful to hear your experience of what it's like as a person of color to walk into one of those meetings, which is supposed to be your opportunity to get to be heard, and what it's like that results in the feeling that you don't have a voice.
Well, I can tell you, you know, they do have these open houses set up, and at the same time, they say, we want your comment, but we only want it online. We have a draft of Code Next, but it's only in English, and we're only going to translate certain portions of Code Next. So if you can access that information online, if you know how to use a computer, and if you know English, that's the opportunity for engagement. So I think right off the bat, there are a lot of people that don't feel invested in participating because they don't feel like they are actually going to be heard. On top of, engagement is more challenging if you work long hours, you know, if there is no childcare, if you are struggling with transportation. So I think that there are challenges in the format, right, of how community engagement can be done or is being done in this city that immediately prevent people from participating. I think in one of the timelines that I've seen that they have at Code Next, you know, there's no mention of the master plan as far as zoning and policy in this city. So there's no acknowledgement of what the city has done to communities of color, to poor people in the city. So in that regard, it doesn't inspire a lot of faith. That's not to say that people still aren't finding ways to voice their concerns. There is a group, Susanna, I think, mentioned it last time, the Eastern Crescent Right to Stay Coalition. And we are beginning to do more work in East Austin around finding out what people's needs and concerns are, not just around Code Next, but housing in general. I think people won't necessarily hear Code Next and think that they should care. I think the bigger question is, you know, what are your immediate housing needs? What can the city do to make sure that you are able to stay, that you do have affordable housing, that you don't have to think about moving to Pflugerville, or Manor because you can't afford to rent or buy wherever you are.
So it goes back to kind of what we were saying in the beginning about the relationship between policymakers and officials at the city level and the community. The effort that Rocío just described is a grassroots effort. It's something that a group of people who understood the disconnect organized. It's important to note that Code Next is over 1,000 pages long and its language is not accessible. So if you're not well versed in city politics and city ordinance, and I know very little about planning and zoning. So when I got immersed in this issue and I'm reading this 1,000+ page document, this is like taking a whole course, just so I can understand what's going to happen in my community. And so there's so many ways, and we understand that oppression is systemic, right? This happens on a systemic level. And so from the top, when they decided that they were going to implement this and, people of color were not included, to the bottom when they host a meeting and it's at, from 4:30 p.m. to 12 a.m. So Rocío can also tell you, oftentimes when we go down to the city to engage on any issue, public hearings sometimes last until midnight. The last one I attended, I wasn't able to speak until like 11:30 p.m. And my group, BSN, brought loads of people from the community, or a handful of people from the community. Many of them had to leave. I had a father tell me, I gotta put my kids in bed. So this happens, this is how systemic oppression happens. You create a process that doesn't work for a group of people, and you completely exclude them that way. It doesn't look like in the beginning they said, okay, black or brown people won't be a part of this conversation. It looks like them not being considered all along the way, and if there was representation there at the top, maybe there would be more true representation, maybe there would be more consideration for these communities throughout that process.
Other questions?
Thank you both very much for the history as well as sharing your own personal experiences to a group of strangers. That was really appreciated. I want to kind of keep on the same vein of like the systemic oppression of communities of color here in Austin, and talking about the code, but also particularly like restrictive covenants, because I feel like Austin is just like an overbloated like college town, right? Like this is, for me, I'm from the Midwest, from like a farming town, so like it still feels like a small town here, like the way people talk about it and like romanticize about it, but it's a city of almost 1 million people now, and a lot of restrictive covenants don't allow for densities, and there's lots of questions about density and displacement here in the city. I'd like to get your take on sort of entrenched, wealthier communities that have covenants in place already, that regardless of zoning changes are theirs, and communities of color which perhaps have either not been organized or have been sort of eviscerated through these processes. Both people want to stay. What do you see? You're organizers, so I assume you're optimistic. So, like, what do you see? How do you see this, like, working?
I feel like optimism is a daily battle, probably for everybody. Honestly, I don't know. I think that a lot of people point to density as the solution, and I don't necessarily think that that's going to solve some of these problems. If it goes back to exclusion, if it goes back to, pointing to things like ADUs or the accessory dwelling units as a way to create more housing, create additional income, but it's only certain communities that are able to have the money to build ADUs and make additional income in those, and take advantage of things like that. It's really hard to see a solution in some ways. I think that the struggle for housing, for land, has been going on for a long time in the city, and a lot of the residents that would benefit the most from just practices in housing are giving up and leaving because of their kids. We didn't go into it here, but people who are surveyed who are now living in Pflugerville or in Manor, you know, they talked about leaving because they wanted their kids to be able to have access to a better education. And they saw that what's happening in Austin ISD doesn't line up with what they want for their kids, right? So I think it's, you know, how do we also engage newcomers so that they understand some of this history? And that includes developers, because I think it's going to take people on all sides with different interests to be able to stop some of this bleeding that's happening in our communities. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, I really, at this point, because of everything that we discussed, don't really place much faith in these processes in terms of protecting my community. And so what BSN focuses on, like I said earlier, is building alternatives and building autonomy. That means economically empowering our communities so that we can stake a claim and collectively and collaboratively preserve land, educate our kids. We have Farming for Black Freedom, feed ourselves, right? But what I hope, and the reason that I'm here today, is that, well, I'll say this. So we had a meeting the other day, and a good friend of mine who is heavily invested in policy reform said, you know, as a reformist, I see it as my job to write and push for policy that will bring us as close to the mission of grassroots organizations as possible. He knows that most likely within his lifetime he'll never get there, right? He'll never be right at that point. But he said that he felt his job was to push the conversation as far left as possible and never impede the efforts of the community. And so while I don't have great faith that these processes will ever really serve my community, I'm hoping that by having conversations like this with people like you all, you will take on the mentality that my friend Chris has, that you will always work to bring us as close to that point as possible and never impede our efforts.
Thank you all for your presentation again. I really enjoyed it. Just thinking about a lot of your topics with segregation and integration, and thinking about the idea of Clarksville. And what do you all feel about, you know, in this political correct culture, like pushing for a space that is somewhat segregated and allowing people of color to work autonomously in their own communities and having control of their own communities? I know it's kind of hard to think about right now, and people, there will be a lot of pushback against trying to do that. But looking at all of the things stacked up against people of color, especially in Austin, how do you feel about pushing for something where the community is autonomous in itself and having a place like Clarksville, having the ability to, you know, work for your own goods, your own initiatives?
So that is what Black Sovereign Nation was founded to do. So it's not hard for me to think about. It's actually what I think the solution is for communities of color. I think that the solution is cooperative economics. The solution is economic empowerment, like I said earlier, and not, you know, in this capitalist way that we've been taught to think about economic empowerment, but collective empowerment. And so we are, even in terms of, and I'm sorry if I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, but even in terms of excessive force and those types of issues that marginalized communities face, talking about true community policing, putting this in the hands of the communities that are affected and allowing them to ensure the safety of their own neighborhoods. I definitely think that's the way to go, but we have to be willing to sacrifice to do that, right? And it looks like a lot of really hard work, and it looks like probably poverty for a little bit, to be honest, because you're disengaging this economic system, this political system that you've come to rely very heavily on for a short period of time so that you can develop something that is your own. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, and I think I love the idea of autonomous communities. One of the, learning about what the Zapatista community is doing in southern Mexico, where the indigenous population essentially said, we're distancing ourselves from the government, the Mexican government, we don't want anything to you, we're going to set up our own systems of self-government. I would love to see that. I know it's I have my doubts about whether it's something that can happen here, but that's something that I see as a positive, as a struggle for sort of revolution in people being able to create the societies that they want to see. At the same time, I also live here in Austin. I feel a responsibility to participate and do what I can here in this way, while still, like, I think you still need to envision what feels impossible, what seems impossible, and that's how you make progress. That's how you keep going.
And what Rocio's saying is really important about still having a responsibility, because so for example, BSN has Kuakubwa, which is a community facilitated school. While we have that, there are tons of Black and brown students who are still at LBJ, who are still at, Keeling, and so they deserve a voice too, right? So I really understand, and I've come to understand it more throughout my own experience, because I started off very like, just forget it all, we're just gonna build our own. And I mean, through my work, I realized, not everybody's gonna jump on that ship, and those people still deserve representation, so.
Great. I really hate to cut off this conversation very early. Well, many thanks to Rocío and Njera to share their touching stories, illustrate with very nice photos and professional quality GIS maps. Great. Well, listening to their talks, some images kind of into my mind, some vague or clear things we have read, for example, about Robert Moses' work back in the early days, last century in New York, or things that were written by Jane Jacobs. And it's sad that some history may repeat, may happen again if we don't learn really from history in the right way. Things happening sadly now, this century, after more than a half century work efforts still happening around us. So we got to make efforts. We, as the current or future planning professions or educators or researchers, scholars, we really need to work together, learn from, together with and learn from the local community, so that we will not repeat the bad stories happening in the past. So just thank them for the great presentation.